The Time Traveler's Wife. First, a 2003 novel, then a 2009 film, and now a 2022 Stephen Moffat HBO series. And what could be more Stephen Moffat than this? It's not just that he's adapting a novel he loves so much and so clearly influenced and echoed across his work, such as on Doctor Who. It's that the whole story and format and characters here marry up Moffat's interest in ambitious structure and writerly format tricks with his interest in sitcom hijinks, relationship comedy, sex and romance, and observations on domestic living. For better or worse, the show very much feels like a culmination of his career, and Moffat at his most Moffiest, in threading together all these big interests of his with two main characters that echo the archetypes he's been playing with since Press Gang, with relationship comedy and sitcom stylings like from his shows Coupling and Joking Apart, creative adaptation of another author's written word like in Sherlock, Jekyll, Dracula, interest and playfulness in form and structure that pervades across virtually all his work, and, of course, time travel, driving it all, with the show sure to make any Doctor Who viewer connect a lot of dots on just how influential this novel was for Stephen Moffat and how deep his love runs for it. So, to talk about episode 1 of Moffat's adaptation of the novel today, it's going to be myself, Neo from Australia, along with my friends Ingiga and Oliver from England. Are you guys enjoying the show so far?
So far, yeah.
I mean, it's one episode, but I'm liking it a lot.
So what exactly is this story that Moffat's adapting? Well, The Time Traveler's Wife is a 2003 novel, a debut novel from American novelist Audrey Niffenegger, basically about a couple living a marriage out of order. The husband travels through time at unpredictable intervals. He just pops up in another time and place completely naked before eventually shifting time again. And the book mines a lot out of that premise, exploring ideas about how we are or are not different people all throughout our lives, the effects people have on each other, what it means to form yourself around or for someone, the deep connections between love and loss, how absence affects people, all those sorts of ideas and observations on love and relationships and aging, all through that big high concept idea of a man and woman meeting themselves at different points in their lives, at different ages relative to each other, even as they ultimately marry. It's a kind of magical realism idea a lot of character stuff is done with, but the book gets pretty specific with the timey-wimey time travel rules. So there's definitely sci-fi in there too, free will, determinism, all that genre jazz. But of course, much as Moffat adores the book, the show is of course, as befitting HBO, not just made for book readers. And so while I believe Oliver and myself have read the novel, Ingiga, you have not?
Yes, I have not read the book at all. I mean, I've watched Moffat's previous Doctor Who show, so that's kind of spoilers for lots of things, but I have not read the book.
Yeah, and of course there's zero expectation that anyone watching the show would have, or anyone listening to this as well. It's worth making clear now from the outset that while what we're doing here is a discussion of this specific show, episode 1 of season 1 of The Time Traveler's Wife, we are going to make reference to other Stephen Moffat work, especially Doctor Who when it's relevant. I still haven't even seen all of Stephen Moffat's work. I haven't seen Sherlock yet, so don't worry, listeners. If you don't always know the specific examples that might get raised, I don't either. The overall point is just that while this show really melds a lot of different stuff Moffat's done over his career, it's super clear that this 2003 novel influenced him a lot. Do any examples spring to mind for you two guys?
From the get-go, you have a little red-headed girl running after an imaginary friend.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's just small things like basically his whole era.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, when he'd first read the novel, he'd just written his first episodes for Doctor Who, the Christopher Eccleston series. And of course, his first David Tennant episode, The Girl in the Fireplace, is really similar to The Time Traveler's Wife, through having two sort of romantically entwined characters meet each other out of order, and especially that the handsome, confident time traveler type sort of imprints himself on a girl in her childhood, and she subsequently arguably forms herself around him in a knotty way. We're definitely getting to that topic eventually. But yes, suffice to say, this is a case of a writer adapting a work that's had a big influence on them for basically 20 years. In fact, the novelist's second novel had a character watching that David Tennant Girl in the Fireplace episode, so that mutual respect between Moffat and the novelist sprung up pretty early. And of course, Moffat eventually wrote a literal Time Traveler's Wife tale through the River Song Doctor's Wife character, and he did a lot of time traveler imprinting on a young girl with the red-headed Amelia Pond character that Gig mentioned. There are all sorts of other links too. We could be here all day talking about that. And it's little wonder, because this book was a real book club favorite, I know. Had lots of word of mouth and readership, lots of praise for its novelty and its concept. Its emotional journeys really resonated for some people, but others found it clunky, trite, kind of gender essentialist, and even outright alarming, creepy, disgusting. And that's the other thing I really want to make clear here at the start. We will be discussing the actual events of this first episode in our discussion here. This isn't a spoiler-free impressions of episode 1. We'll talk through the actual events of episode 1, but without spoiling things from later into the novel or the series. That said, obviously the novel, the film, and now the show raise serious concerns on some topics, most prominently the relationship or adjacency or depiction, depending on your perspective, I suppose, of grooming, or at least a child forming themselves up around, in the story's terms, an older person, and what it might mean for a story to be doing that. We'll definitely get into that topic eventually and have a deservingly big, proper, serious conversation about it, but this is episode 1. So we're not going to be doing it here. We'll do it in a later discussion when it's more clear what the story is doing and what the stances of the creators behind it may be. We're not ignoring it, we're just waiting for when we can have the most fruitful conversation on it this season. And for this discussion, we're going to have the more fruitful conversations we can have about this first episode. And so coming off that kind of grim note, why don't we hear in Moffat's own words what drove him to adapt this story? Actually, before we hear Moffat say why he's adapting this story, why do you guys think he's adapting this? What do you think drove him to adapt this novel now?
I think you could view it as the telos of his career, or you could view it as a backslide for his career. But one way or another, he's been rewriting bits of this story for years and years. So this is his chance to finally just do it without any of the, I guess, intermittent, other elements intruding on it.
Yeah. Feels like that. It feels a bit liberated.
Yeah.
It's such a natural fit for TV because it's episodic. The book is not episodic, but it's episodic. It has episodes of meetings and encounters and how they relate to things across time. The whole structure of it, scenically, the really interesting thing about this is the scene by scene structure bleeding into the next scene. And the connections between each scene are time travel, but also stories within stories and flashbacks that lead to time travel through the present. It's all very televisual in the way that it's structured, which I think is quite natural.
It's a great opportunity for Moffat to do what he loves, which is be very clever.
On that note of what he loves, let's hear him himself say why he's adapting it.
Tell us what motivated you to adapt The Time Traveller's Wife.
Well, just the fact that I love the book. I mean, there's no point in adapting something you hate, otherwise you'll be fighting it all the time. I just love the book, and when you love something, you kind of want to explain why and how. Despite the fantastical setting of it and the fantastical idea of it, this brilliant time travel idea, it's actually about a relationship. That's what it's about. It's not about time travel. Time travel just gets in the way, or time travel is the prism through which we see a normal, happy relationship. We don't do a lot of those in fiction. Happy relationships end at the altar and start again if there's a divorce or a death. We don't do the bit that we all live through, years of being perfectly happy with each other. That sort of doesn't happen, does it? But she found a way to make that interesting by reminding you that love and loss are linked to each other. Love means loss, and the time travel element never allows our heroes to forget that the end is in sight. And that's true for all of us, but they are constantly reminded of it. So I think because you can relate to it, because you can ground yourself in that relationship.
It's an incredibly effective little, I guess, narrative device, metaphor, but not quite, of just taking a relationship and putting it through the prism of time travel.
Yeah.
But it's just an absolutely fantastic idea. That does so many things. It works on so many levels. There's some slightly obvious lines in this episode. I can't remember exactly what it is, but something like to what our lives are intertwined inextricably forever. And he's like, yeah, it's called marriage.
Yeah.
There's lots of little bits like that. Going, this is an extraordinary relationship, but the way in which it's extraordinary is ordinary. It's all heightened versions of real things. The whole thing of meeting, and grooming. But the whole thing of meeting your future husband when you're a kid is sort of a simulation of that feeling of fate, of falling so deeply in love with someone you can't imagine not ever having been with them. It's a simulation of that, and it's not an unproblematic simulation of that. But that's the emotion it's capturing, metaphorically.
The line you mentioned earlier, I think it's so interesting. It's this exchange that Henry and Claire have where it's said that I grew up waiting for you, longing for you. I formed myself around you, the idea of you, and you're an arsehole. And that's what she's resenting and struggling with, dealing with there. So for Claire, she met Henry when she was a child. And so she feels imprinted on by him in that way is what she's expressing. And then for Henry, who's of course when he first met Claire, Claire had more knowledge of the relationship and everything than him. And he says, the man you formed yourself around, shock twist, formed himself around you. Then we get the exchange. That's fucked up. So fucked up. It has a name. Marriage. Two people trying to be the person the other one already thinks they are. Love, basically. Which is such a big Moffat-y, such a huge concept and such a grounded concept in how relationships work or how he perceives relationships and identity working that's being done in such a high concept, interesting way through the show. There's obviously a real adjacent aspect to grooming because of how we're getting this when he's in his 40s and she's a child. And for him, Moffat, I'll go into this more later with his quotes, but he characterizes it as Henry fell in love with Claire when he met her as an adult, in that library. So he's fallen in love with this woman as an adult and he loves adult Claire. It's not his fault that his time travel craziness made him meet Claire as a child after, and that was the first interaction for her. I think it'll make more sense to really delve into the grooming discussion in later episodes because there's going to be more material to have a better, more rounded conversation about that because it's obviously a conversation that's got to be had. But for now, I'm kind of interested what the TV viewer among us who doesn't know how all of this plays out, like Oliver and I do, thinks of all that. What do you think of all that, Gig?
Well, I guess it's really, fundamentally at the end of the day, because it all revolves around this, predetermination idea and stuff happening just because the author has willed it to happen, pretty much. It's always the way with causal loop storylines, characters who are pretty much locked into doing one specific set of things by fate and paradoxes, and that's just how time has spooled itself out, I guess. To a certain extent, it strips the characters of the ability and thus the responsibility to, change the future in any particular way. In a way, when Moffat wrote Forest of the Dead, and the Doctor was about to, the Doctor said, well, I can die, I can sacrifice myself instead of you, and time can be rewritten. When he came up with that time can be rewritten thing, he was reintroducing that idea of free will. So the Doctor and River, they have the option to change the future and change what happens, but they don't want to because they value what they have so much, right? Whereas when you have a setup like this, where older Henry has to lay the groundwork for young Claire to fall in love with him because that's their future marriage and blah, 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 blah. It's sort of on one hand, it's it's unfair because Claire doesn't really get to have her own, self-willed life in any particular way. But at the same time, it's it's unfair because this is the construct that the author has created and put them in. So it's sort of it sort of transcends the idea of responsibility on a human level and just becomes I feel like we're getting into stuff that we'll just end up talking about a lot more in future episodes, but really it's as metaphors go rather, it's one that kind of sort of trivializes the idea of being able to morally judge ethically whatever the characters are doing. I feel like the baseline just for now for episode 1 and a bit onward is the novelist Audrey Niffenegger and Stephen Moffat see it in that kind of metaphorical construct way that Gig is talking about. They're not making a commentary on grooming, with what we're seeing now. It'll make more sense for us as an audience to discuss that later. But the idea right now is, as they're saying, in Moffat's word, he says,
that's not what the story is in the book or the film or the TV show. He's married to her. He meets her as an adult. He falls in love with her. He takes her to the altar. He gets married to her. And then he's flung back in time through no fault of his own and is confronted with the childhood version of the woman he already loves. And even more so in the TV show version, he absolutely makes it clear he's just a friend, and he makes the absolute rule that he will never reveal who he is in her future. The version of Henry that goes back in time, the grown-up version, he's a very responsible man, so he has tremendously strict rules about this. If one of them changes the other, Claire changes Henry. Claire is exactly the same person as a little girl as she is when you see her in her 70s. Exactly the same person. Henry flows round Claire like a river round a rock. He's just, he makes himself the man she wants him to be because he loves her.
It's interesting, given within this episode, we have a line that basically makes a gag of the grooming thing, which and I assume that's Moffat's invention, and it does seem like the sort of thing he'd invent, because he seems to have a trouble with taking things seriously. In fact, he wrote an entire show about his own inability to take things seriously, and I think that's kind of the point when you can start to maybe view Moffat a bit dimly in terms of making that kind of thing into a joke. It's like you don't really need to. Like, come on, please. Why?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a reasonable. We'll get in. We're doing enough talking around the grooming thing. Suffice to say, we'll get into the actual discussion later. Baseline for now is the novelist and the showrunner don't humor it.
Yeah, not to dwell on the grooming thing, but I think stories like River and Amy's story are very conscious of the. He wouldn't use the term grooming, but the traumatic influence of, in that case, the Doctor over characters' childhoods. And that it makes some connection between the idea of time travel determining your future, knowing your future because of time travel, and sort of losing your agency because of that trauma, right? Amy and River both reclaim their agency.
You know the end of Flesh and Stone where Amy jumps the Doctor and tries to, bang him, have a one-night stand because she's been so imprinted on him, and the Doctor's like, no, and just shoves her into the TARDIS, and that gets shut down. Well, if you imagine that scene had played out, but they'd actually had sex and there was really romantic music playing over it, that would be this episode, basically. The Time Traveler's one.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because it's also framed as him being a prick for that.
Yeah.
I think. Okay, I've got a question. Is this confusing to most audiences?
Or just to watch, like the experience of watching it?
Yeah, the episode, the structure of it, the way it works.
I mean, I don't know. I haven't looked at what other people are saying, but I feel like Moffat has done his best to make it easy to follow. And obviously the captions on screen indicating like what age everyone is at every time probably helps as well. But at the same time, you've also got, you've got wig Henry, you've got short-haired Henry, you've got kid Henry. You can follow the way the characters are distinguished from versions of themselves, I think. I don't think it's too hard so far. Most
complaints I've seen about the show are about the big issues we were touching on and we'll talk more about later. And there's a lot of adjectives I could use. The dialogue, basically, which a lot of it is original, but it's very much in the vein of what the novelist was doing, which are these really poetic statements about love and, big humany-woomany things in a very kind of heightened style, which is how Moffat writes and it's how the novelist writes. And it's they're doing it big here for sure. And that doesn't work for a lot of people. But if you love, those really heightened poetic lines on Doctor Who and you don't mind real people don't talk like that, then the dialogue probably will work for you some of the time.
I think just in terms of being able to follow it, I noticed that Moffat has been very front and center with theme in this episode.
Yes.
Whereas with something like Dracula episode 3, for example, kind of people rage at that because Dracula has an iPad or whatever, and they sort of don't really pay attention to the big thematic exploration going on in that episode. I think with an episode like this, Moffat is so front and center with theme, saying stuff like, "Oh wow, this whole thing's just a metaphor for marriage and love, isn't it?" Like just putting it all on the table. Like how can you possibly miss the point of this when it's so shoved in your face? I think it will be very easy to follow in that sense.
I think stripping out the genre, I mean, it's a time travel thing, but stripping out the genre in a way, I think is what is making this interesting for me. It's Doctor Who without monsters. It's just nailing down and focusing on the characters.
I have to say, Gig said shoving in the face and Oliver said stripping out. I feel like it's worthy of comment, the whole naked conceit here, especially how it's realised in live action with an actual actor. and this is an HBO show, of course. This isn't one of Moffat's British BBC shows. What did you guys make of all the nudity?
What kind of comments would you think would be appropriate here? Keeping it PG-13.
Go for it.
I don't really have anything to say, honestly. Like, obviously he's very pretty. And like, I guess it's nice to be watching a Moffat thing where it's like the guy who's objectified. So that's a refreshing change. I mean, it's part of the story. Like, it's I don't know. Like, what else can you say, really?
It's straight from the book. In Moffat's own words, the joke comes from the book. He's just naked every time he times travel. That's how it works. He can't even keep a filling in. Indeed. Why wouldn't that be the case? It's actually quite rational. It's not to my taste, but I am sure it will be to a lot of people. I got rather depressed about seeing endless dailies of Theo James running around naked. Moffat's words.
It's kind of like he's been reborn, isn't it, every time? So he's just spat out into the world with nothing, not even a shirt on his back.
It's like the Terminator as well. I think it makes sense as a time travel thing. And also it makes sense as a Moffat thing. And you look at his earlier like sex comedies and this just links into it so naturally. And of course it's just good TV. It's a big visual. It either works as a visual gag or as a visual hook for people. It's dramatic. It's exciting. It's a fun little aspect of the show, I think. And it feels appropriately timey-wimey as well as lurid, I think.
And it gives him something to do. It means that every time he appears somewhere, it's instantly interesting. There's something immediately to do. It gives some flesh, some meat to the story.
Yeah. Yeah, great.
Why?
I also think Moffat relishes writing the kind of swaggering badass character, who beats people up and quips about it, like the kind of Jekyll, like also maybe Dracula bit, and the Doctor, of course, and Sherlock a little bit as well. Like he loves that stuff. Just having a character who just kind of barges in and like is not necessarily the most morally respectable or whatever, but who just owns every room he goes into.
I really love that about Henry is that Claire is right. He is an arsehole, at least in his 20s. He's not a despicable man, but he's a bit of a prick. And I love that he feels really in the vein of, I thought of Mark from Joking Apart, this great Moffat show that's quite underseen, but I think is fantastic, where he's a complete mess and he's very funny. And so he's very good and disarming at a lot of things, but he's just a total fucking mess and doesn't know who he is, at least in his 20s. And he's a prick to people, but it's with such Moffat-y dialogue that you've got to love him, because it's difficult to write a roguish character where they're both a prick, but you truly like them in spite of that and kind of because of that. But Moffat is so good at dialogue like this that it works really well for me. And the actor, who I didn't really know much before of, besides him having a lot of people really into him, I thought did really well. He did that classic British actor trying to do an American accent where they go really gravelly, and it's like Hugh Laurier's house, and Cumberbatch's Doctor Strange do like the exact same voice. But yeah, he was working for me. I could totally see why someone would fall in love with him. And I liked how he navigated the different Henrys of the different times. I know he said it was like a rule of the direction of the show that he never had to shoot separate time Henrys in the same day. He would always have days locked in as, I'm 20s Henry this day of filming, I'm 40s Henry day this film of filming.
Theo, was it ever confusing when you're on the set and you have to decide or they have to tell you which age you are?
Yeah, it was very confusing continuously. Yeah, I mean, luckily I was able to, we had a rule which meant that one day I would film one age and the next day would be another age. So other than a few days, I basically was able to do that, which helped a lot, because if you're kind of jumping around in ages in the same day, it's going to be a complete head fuck. But yeah, it was something that I had to keep reminding myself of where I am, who I am, what age I am, where I'm going, and where I've been, because the story is, not only do you shoot it out of order, but the story is completely out of order. So it was complicated.
The show wasn't filmed in order, like feels stupid to say, because like there is no order. There is no way you could film it in order. What order are we talking about? But really difficult job for both actors.
I mean, especially having to sell that fucking wig, like, unenviable.
That too. Yeah.
I hate to bring in my own shit, but I've for the last few productions I've written, I've had to make an actual version of the script for what the film is going to be, and then a second version for the actors to go scene by scene, reconstructing sequences because they're telling stories out of order. Because a film I'm working on at the moment it's 3 timelines in the same man's life, actually. So it's very Time Traveler's Wife. But it's just more, feedback from actors is they just much rather having a continuity of character and not having to jump back and forth wildly between different versions of the character. I think that self-interaction is so interesting.
We'll see. I'm excited for Gig to see what's coming in the show because, man, this actor is going to continue to be really challenged by the complexity of what he's going to have to do. But that's so exciting, and this is the perfect writer for it. Like, you go back and you look at the intricacy of the sitcom setups Moffat did in shows like Press Gang, but especially Joking Apart and Coupling. And the complexity is what makes the humor so fascinating and so great, is that you're impressed and your brain is kind of tickled as well as you being really humored by how funny the stuff is going. And he does such a good job. He's actually complicating bits of the book here because this episode adapts the prologue of the book, the first 3 chapters of the book, and a bit of chapter 4 of the book. But it's doing it in such a way where it's really kind of folding the scenes into themselves and increasing the complexity and making it timey-wimey, even really. It feels really deft and it feels really impressive, and he does such a good job with, like, I feel like his career has been, I've been training for this, basically, is how he's upped his skills in time travel storytelling and intricate, like, sex, comedy, sitcom setups as complex as possible. This show just feels like the perfect marriage of those ideas to me, and that's my favorite thing about it, is mixing up all these things Moffat loves and is good at.
It's time farce.
Yeah.
You notice that in this episode, there are 2 kinds of transition. There's the kind where we follow like a character directly. Okay, let me rephrase that. There are 2 kinds of time transition, because there's one where we follow Henry directly traveling from one time period to another. And then there's time where Moffat kind of cheats. So like, child Claire asks adult Henry, like, oh, well, what happened to you or whatever, blah, 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 what went on. And then we basically go straight into a flashback of Kid Henry. And that's kind of the cheat transition. But like, because that little bit of dialogue was put in there to make that feel seamless, when the child flashback eventually loops all the way back into slightly older Henry, I think 20 whatever Henry, getting the flowers for the day earlier in the episode, it feels like that's looped the whole episode round in a lovely little bow. Yeah. So like, Moffat's been very conscientious about keeping the little links in there, so it never feels like we've just jumped for no reason. There's always like a little bit of linking material.
It's very writerly.
Yeah.
Flashing back on certain words and then those flashbacks rounding back to actual scenes that we've seen are lovely. Lovely. The shoe, excellent.
Mm-hmm.
I think what the humany-woomany bit I really like about this episode is I love this concept of you having this idolized version of someone you love, and then you get to know them a bit more, or you get to know a bit more of their history, and this colossal disappointment as you realize this isn't a great person, or even just this is a person. This isn't the ideal I've built up. I feel like that's the real human thing this episode is dealing with. In Moffat's terms, he says there are 2 versions of the story happening here. One is, a hard-drinking, womanizing librarian in Chicago who's a bit nihilistic and thinks life is unfair and is kind of miserable. He's not having a great life. And this gorgeous woman walks up to him, clearly hugely in love with him, and says, "I'm your future wife." And so that's huge and sensational and lifting for him. But for her, this man she's idolized from childhood, who's like imprinted onto her as like this model of kindness and intelligence and creativity and all that sort of thing. Presidential man, Moffat characterizes it as the perfect dad kind of man. Such interesting phrasing he's using there. That's what she thinks Henry's going to be like when she meets him in sync. But when she meets him in sync, she meets, and Moffat says, what most women meet, a complete self-centered asshole. And Moffat says that's what most women have to put up with. Claire is thinking, this one is the best I got. Let me roll up my sleeves and rebuild him into someone else entirely. And that Claire's drive might be to remodel arsehole younger Henry into the Henry she wants to be married to, the Henry from her childhood, which is the Henry from his greater adulthood. And so the two ideas that I think are so interesting is, one, this idea of your effect on people, or how you change people, and how relationships play into that, but also this kind of duality of disappointment at getting to know someone better, or kind of joy at getting to know someone in the first place, like from Henry's perspective. I think these are such high concept stuff, but there are so many relatable little beats there that I think everyone could connect with to their own lives.
It's also the classic Moffat gender dynamics at work. The woman has to do the job of like turning the man into less of an arsehole, having to make him better. It's like the classic thing.
The idea of yourself versus the actual one. The identity you project or you're expected to have versus your fragile human self, and then fulfilling that identity because other people see it in you. That's Doctor Who.
Not in the name of the Henry.
Yeah. Well, that's Doctor Who. This whole part of the episode culminates in a scene which is really similar to the culmination of Peter Capaldi's first 2014 episode of Doctor Who, which ends with who wants to Gig, do you want to speak to that?
And basically, Clara has been really worried about this new doctor she's met, and she's just like, what the fuck's going on? I have to leave. I can't do this anymore. And she gets a phone call from the doctor she likes, who she's really used to. Basically, he's telling her, don't be scared. It's still me in there. Please, give me a chance. Give him/me a chance. So the scene we get here with the two Henrys, or older Henry, basically meeting Claire to kind of try and make her give younger him a chance. It's sort of like that, even though it's technically in reverse because it's the older one kind of making excuses for the younger one rather than the other way around, it feels the same. It's that same kind of scene, like a guy from one period of time trying to sort of make a case for himself from other period of time. So it is that really fascinating, again, Moffat just taking things, rewriting things across his career.
We could fill up hours with saying this reminds us of this Doctor Who episode, because it's bigger than any one resemblance. It's like his writing is... It's not just... I don't feel like he's been formed out of this novel, like he's talking about people forming each other around each other exactly, because he was doing this kind of stuff before 2003. But it is very much like he is on such a similar wavelength as the novelist that it just makes so much sense for him to be adapting this, because it's like it's playing all his notes, and it's glorious to hear him play him this loudly. I guess on that self-aggrandizing note of Moffat and complexity, like we were talking about earlier, I want to read out this one incredible thing from a interview he had with CBR, where the interviewer says, in the first episode, we meet multiple Henrys from multiple time periods that have different appearances. How crazy was it to keep track of them all? The writer's room must have a board with arrows going all over the place. And Moffat replies, there was no writer's room. Here is my rule on this. If you need to write it down, it's not a good enough idea. I always say that. Do you write down your idea? I say. If you have a good idea, do you know what you are not going to do? You are not going to forget it. Memory is a great editor, so I just keep it in my head and I am straight about it. I hate writing treatments. I loathe reading treatments. I keep it in my head. If that sounds impressive or clever, it's not. Your brain is a much more sophisticated recorder of information than a sheet of paper and a pencil. What do you need a whiteboard for goodness sake? The only things you ever write down are so dull you would otherwise forget.
I mean, that's classic Moffat again. Just not even stopping to account for the existence of anyone whose brain doesn't work exactly like his or has exactly the same capacity for storage as his. Yep. If you wanted to be uncharitable, you could say his refusal to write anything down could explain some of his earlier writing decisions. But but I don't think that's what we'll be doing today.
I'm taking this first as a personal attack on me, because one of the four walls of my bedroom is a massive whiteboard, where I put all my ideas so I can keep track of them. So this is a personal attack on me, and I feel insulted. But on the flip side, I entirely know what he means, because most of the work doesn't happen on the whiteboard. It happens on the way to the shops, right? That's the RTD quote about writing. It's not a job you clock in for. It just fucking takes over your brain. You're thinking about it all the time, and you turn a corner of your brain into a little processor to just be working on this story in the background and occasionally foreground.
It's a lovely idea to have a story that is just comprised of those ideas that take hold of you and that you can't like stop thinking about. Like it's a lovely idea just to be able to write like that and just be 100% just remove anything that is not that powerful. But it's probably not how most people work at the end of the day.
Right. Right. I've got something due. I've got a deadline. I need to write it down. Forgive me.
This note of writing stuff down, in the episode, we get this really evocative idea of Claire having this diary of all the dates she's met. Dates is such interesting phrasing for child Claire meeting older Henry. Anyway, all the dates she's met Henry previously, which, well, firstly, that's a really evocative, interesting idea and kind of story-generating thing for his end. And secondly, this is River Song's diary from Doctor Who.
It's even
like
blue.
the exact idea. So that's fun. On that, I think the similarities and differences with Doctor Who are so interesting. Moffat says, on that note, Henry and Claire's life is not an adventure story. That's the big difference. It's a story of people trying to have a marriage, trying to be in love, trying to get home at night, trying to grasp every day of happiness they can while facing the irritant of time travel. The Doctor loves his time travel. He or she wants to run back to her TARDIS as often as possible, but Henry, he'd just rather go home to his wife. That's what he wants to do.
There's a slightly uncomfortable, but you can sort of see the point it's making, line about disability in the first episode, Time Traveler's Wife, where the exact wording is, Henry says, it's what's wrong with me. It's a disability, which is slightly uncomfortable. Yeah. It's not great. But that is the fact that this is a it's a condition. It's something that happens to him rather than a superpower.
Yeah.
Is very much centered in the show. This is a personal hurdle. It's a physical thing that makes his emotional, social life harder.
And that's real, isn't it? Like, there are real marriages where, the partner is taking care of their partner who has, some condition or something that they didn't choose, that something just makes their life difficult, and they still make it work. So there's something very human about it all.
I think, well, the episode ends with Claire saying, long ago men went to sea and women waited for them, scanning the horizon for the tiny ship. Even just a simple thing as one of the members of a marriage being away lots of the time, not being at home, not being with their partner. For whatever reason, having to be away a lot, it's the most relatable thing in the world. And that's the basis of the whole marriage and the story, really, is that Henry is all the time absent from Claire's life. And this is the love and loss being the same thing that Moffat was talking about. And it's really interesting to explore that.
What is grief, if not?
Yeah.
It's keying into all those house themes of reliability. The reliability of men is such an essential Moffat theme. It is in the ritual dynamics of straight relationships. He views returning as something men struggle to do, being there, being reliant, being around all the time when they're needed, being able to help when asked is what men are for. And so, like, I snarkily tweeted a few days ago how excited I am for this Moffat show about the out-of-time, death-cheating Superman's complex relationship with his ordinary, emotionally intelligent soulmate partner, whose fundamentally different perspectives, like opposite polarity magnets, inseparably unhealthily fuse them. Because everything he's written is that. It's all that. Yeah. It's all that. It's all that dichotomy, that relationship, that very gendered relationship between the roles that these two different characters have, exemplifying different aspects of characters that bring out the flaws and the strengths in the other. It's codependence. It's all about codependence, and positive codependence and unhealthy codependence.
Yeah, it's Moffat. A pet thing of Moffat is this kind of gender essentialism, like we were speaking to earlier with how men are presented here. It's part of the game you get with him, is this kind of normalization. Well, is that the right word? This kind of presentation of codependence and like the roles for gender and stuff like that. Well, he said the word irritant earlier. We can use that here as well. Why do we indulge it?
It's a good question. I think because he writes really good episodes, and we just go with it. I think it's because the characters are good enough that you just kind of. I think it's easy to forgive when the characters that come out of it are so human and nuanced in themselves. If it was just the gender essentialist garbage and there wasn't the good substance behind it, I think we'd be a lot less forgiving.
Yeah.
And I think it's also more than that. I think he writes so much about gender because he's a romantic and he writes relationships and he's straight, so he writes straight relationships mostly. And in any relationship, be it romantic or otherwise, you are looking for what defines these people in opposition to each other and in relation to each other. And gender is a big part of that. I mean, in any relationship, especially in the straight ones. But I think if you look to something like Dracula, where the relationship at the center of it is gendered, but it's not romantic at all. It's sort of vaguely romantically coded, but it's not actually a relationship. But they're each, they're set oppositionally to each other. And, I think the best example is Sherlock, which
Neo hasn't watched.
Oh, come on.
One day.
Which it turns out, shock, isn't a romance, but, which does the same, exactly the same thing of pairing these two inseparable lead characters and defining them in opposition and relation to each other. Watson's strengths complement Sherlock's weaknesses as the books are. But it's the same basic idea between two men, and there it's not playing so much on gender because gender isn't so much of a factor in the relationship. I think the gender essentialism is a often problematic side effect of just really digging into what makes these two characters different to each other. What are their roles in relationship to each other? How does this whole system work? And sometimes gender's a big part of that.
Just don't watch only Moffat stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Everything in moderation. Watch some stuff without the gender essentialism as well.
Yeah. Basically it.
Yeah. On the romance thing, our lovely showrunner here says it reminds you that tragedy underpins every love story and that every day is valuable. There is no such thing as happily ever after. There's happy for a bit. And then he talks a bit about how, as a time traveler, Henry has to be more aware of his mortality than others. And he's thinking, how could anyone live, being more aware of their mortality? Oh, wait, I know, I 100% know my mortality. I'm going to die eventually. Why am I not freaking out about that every day? So I think there's a lot in the story, in the book, and, in the show as well about, it's like that love and loss mixing, but it's also that happiness and tragedy mixing, that every love story has an end, which is, they either break up or one of them dies first. And so the adjacent nature of the happy stuff with the sad stuff, I think is really interesting here when you're playing around with the whole chronology of it.
Yeah, and they lived happily, right?
River Song ending.
It's a River Song ending.
Yeah. How does that go? It's what does it say?
Basically, and they lived happily ever after, and then the ever after kind of fades away, and it's just they lived happily on screen. Really lovely.
Something this is a bit of a different note, but something I love in the episode is when we have 20s Henry training really young Henry in the museum.
I was going to ask Gig if you saw that coming.
Yeah, Gig, did you see that coming?
I mean, when they says a man taught me all the rules of time travel, I mean, it's pretty obvious.
Yeah, I was gonna.
Come on,
It seems it. Because it's still played as a little bit of a reveal.
It's kind of a little, maybe a small surprise to Henry, at least a little bit. I mean, maybe he worked out at some point, but like he still, when he finally goes around and does it, it's like, oh wow, okay, yep, this is happening.
I love this because it's such a lonely note, and I think it's such a adulthood thing of like realizing, or it coming true for you, that there isn't anyone else. Like there's you, and that's who's going to take care of you. There's only you. I think it's such a moment a lot of people will get at some point in their lives where it's like, it's just me in here, basically. And I really love that kind of gulf of loneliness, but also kind of self-assurance of, well, you know, this is what I've got, so I have to become strong. I have to learn to do X, Y, and Z. You know, I'm all I am, and I've only got me. As much as he's in a marriage, the only constant in his life is him. He's going to be in every scene of his life, only him. And I just love that kind of tragedy and melancholy moment of young Henry having to realize eventually, you know, and by the fact that older Henry realizes it, that there's no one else. It's just him.
It's the moment of realizing that your parents are people.
Exactly.
But done through you being your parent, right?
Yeah.
You saw that there was this aspirational figure, and then you get to a point and you realize, oh, well, I'm that figure and I'm shit.
Yeah.
They were always just human.
Yeah, and this is the whole, if you don't vibe with this sort of thing, which is, you know, totally appropriate if you don't, but if you don't, I'm not sure there's going to be a time later when it might start to vibe for you, because this is the big idea, big humany-woomany relatable moments processed through this time travel high concept. That's the bread and butter of the story here. And I know for some people, the way a story like this works, the way it's told, they might see it as just a big structural gimmick or refer to it with some term like that. But I think, yes, it is a big, playful, writerly structure thing. Call it a gimmick if you want, sure. But when people use terms like structural gimmick and things like that, I kind of think like, yeah, aren't we really just talking about form when we say that?
Right, exactly. That's the thing. Structural gimmick's quite a dismissive way of just doing something different with stories, right? We've got a very set, naturalistic, linear way of telling stories in cinema.
Memento isn't a structural gimmick. That's the story.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a structure. Yeah, it's just structure.
It's form. It's daring to be a bit different.
Yeah. I agree that there's some stories where something is treated so lightly and kind of randomly that it feels very gimmicky. But I think we're so used to stories working in a certain way, not always linearly. Like there's some non-linear structures that are so normalized, like an in media res opening, that it seems completely expected and normal to us, that when we get stories in different structures, we feel gimmick because it's out of the ordinary. But often it's not. It's like it's completely the heart of the piece and it's completely built around this. And therefore, I feel like gimmick is the wrong term, and it's just the form of what's happening here. And this story, like you can't put this story in order. It would make no thematic sense, and it would make no sense in general. This is
and which order? Whose order?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And most stories, right? It's why I'm so in love with non-linear form twisting stuff. Is that I'm pretty sure this is a Moffat quote as well, but no one remembers a story in the order it happened.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Real life isn't one scene and then another scene and then another.
I think Moff wrote a whole mini-sode about that, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't think in order. That's why he's not the only person to think this, but it's why non-linear stuff can work even more logically to our brains in some ways. It's because, like we were saying earlier, how cleverly the episode kind of threads the needle of, like, a character will say a line and then it'll connect to the next scene, even though, like, it's not a literal cut to the next scene, but it makes sense that our brains would go there now. It's because our brains are always, traveling forward, and that'll be through memories, and that'll be through something in the present. So it makes sense for stories to work that way as well, if it can be done well. Speaking of structure, what really interests me, and I know Moffat's talked about this a lot when he's talking about what's different between the novel to the film to the TV show, because he says TV proceeds as a series of short stories. Each episode has to be complete in and of itself. You need a little 3-act story each week, so sometimes you have to move things around. And then he's talking about how his love of the book persevering is going to be what matters, and that he's keeping so many details correct that fans of the book will recognize what he's doing. He's telling the same story, but structurally stuff is being moved around to make episodes all work as their own 3-act stories. I don't know about you, Oliver, but I was actually surprised. Was it just me, or did this feel really faithful to the book? I thought way more would be changed. Like, obviously he changed the order of some stuff, but this felt really close to the first 3 chapters to me.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact structure that well, enough to say really. But it also feels very episodic.
Yeah.
I felt at the end of the episode, oh, that's an episode of TV. That's a little story. In a way that I don't with a lot of entirely linear TV. But it feels like it's doing those small rearrangements and the structural stuff. It's interesting that it's adapting it almost scene for scene.
Yeah.
But just using the adaptation to reorder things slightly and do that structural perspective stuff. It's an interesting way of doing an adaptation.
Well, I love this. He says, sometimes you see an adaptation of a book and it just feels as though you've chopped up the book into 6 hours and fed it through. I don't think that honors the original. You've got to really make it a beast that survives in its new environment, and television is a different experience from a novel. You're not correcting it, you're not fixing what was once wrong, you are adapting it to a new landscape. Hopefully the television show feels the same as reading the book. I love that approach to adaptation, where it's not about literally reproducing it, it's about how can I do this effect in this new form, which might mean changing a lot, but it's about trying to process it in the most alive way you can for the new format.
Dracula 3.
Yeah. Or Harness's War of the Worlds, I think, was doing a similar thing where he's changing a lot of the letters, but I think it's really processing how to make the book work as TV and as TV made now. I love that form of adaptation. Well, on that note, is there anything you're interested to see if the TV show might change or approach differently or anything like that in the coming weeks?
I'm interested to see how much it engages with the grooming. That angle on the story. Feels like something they're very much shooting down. It's not a story about a groomer and someone being groomed, but it feels like you have to engage with the question to shoot it down, right?
It's such a big and serious conversation that I think on whatever terms the show is going to have it, it's going to be later. And so, of course, we'll have it later too.
I would predict...
Yeah.
I would predict Henry framing himself as a groomer later on. Self-deprecating, look how much I've fucked you up kind of thing.
Moffat says...
The version of Henry that goes back in time, the grown-up version, he's a very responsible man, so he has tremendously strict rules about this. If one of them changes the other, Claire changes Henry. Claire is exactly the same person as a little girl as she is when you see her in her 70s. Exactly the same person. Henry flows round Claire like a river round a rock. He's just, he makes himself the man she wants him to be because he loves her.
That sounds mildly like a cope. The idea that she's the same person as a child when she's an adult. And what? Does that even make any sense?
Even the phrasing of tremendously strict rules is like odd implications, I think, were very not intended by Moffat there.
Yeah, good men don't need rules, so I've heard.
Yeah. I love this idea of people reforming each other intentionally or otherwise, but yeah, obviously this is being processed in a weird way through the child stuff, and we'll get more into that as the show does.
Do you have anything to comment about the music before we finish? Because I know you were a fan of it, Neo, how they handled the soundtrack.
Well, it's not any of Moffat's usual composers. It's this new composer for him from America that did the Pacific. I was bowled over by it. It was so old-fashioned. It felt like an old movie to me. It was so whimsical at times, and it was so propulsive at times, and it was so loud. It was I'm a big Murray Gold fan, so I like music to be loud and in my face, and it really was for so much of this. I love that. Felt so romantic to me. I was really, really taken by it. I felt so swallowed up by how in my face it was.
Yeah, it was pulling a lot of weight in sequences with no speech. And it was doing that quite well, like just in terms of keeping control of the show and just doing the storytelling when there wasn't anyone blabbing over the top of it.
It's the easiest way to win me over to a show is just by having really great music like that. And so I was super engaged by it. Oliver, what did you think of it?
I have to pay more attention. I didn't notice at all. I have to pay more attention.
I
didn't particularly notice the the performances either, to be honest. I was very focused on the script, and
it's a dense piece of television. Yeah, for sure.
it is. Man. I just like good TV. I like TV that I can sit and think about afterwards. Because I was very aware of the, I guess, controversy around the casting, and then just got the characters and didn't really think about the performances, and didn't think about the music, which I guess means it was working, right? I'll pay more attention to that for the next one.
Well, what's your overall evaluation of the first episode, guys?
Based on what you said about the dialogue, I basically get why someone who doesn't like Moffat wouldn't like this. It is very, marriage is just a flat circle. But I like that shit. I like the philosophizing. I like the form of it. I found it powerful and effective and exciting, and I want TV to be more like this, and I'm excited for the next one.
Geek, what did you think?
I think it's as confident and exciting and compelling as an introduction to this kind of story as you could hope for. Yeah, I think it's going quite well.
Yeah, I think if you like lyrical dialogue that maybe doesn't sound like real people speaking, and if you like what you can call structural gimmickry, and if you can stand a little bit of weird gender stuff, then you're going to love this. If any of that raises alarm bells for you, you're probably not going to love this. Well, that's our discussion for the first week, for the first episode. There are so many topics we didn't get into because we've got 5 more discussions to have. Some of the stuff we're going to touch on in future weeks is what exactly the form of the show is in terms of how many episodes and how many seasons and what it's doing with the book exactly. I want to get a little more into the nature of what it's doing with time. Compare it with the movie a bit in a way that makes sense for people who haven't seen the movie. Like, I don't know if you two have seen it.
I have not.
Nope.
The show is reacting against the movie in some ways. I'll explain later, as they say. It's quite interesting, especially Moffat's comments on the film. What the show is doing with Claire specifically, this is the other big complaint I saw about the show, mostly specifically from book readers. The show is rewiring Claire in a way, and Rose Leslie, the actress, and Moffat have both talked about this, and so I'm going to get more into that into future weeks because it's really, really interesting. I also want to get more into the novelist herself, who's a very interesting woman, and her relationship with Moffat and how they came to know each other and what they think of each other is really interesting. We'll talk about that more in future weeks. What the novelist is doing now as well is really interesting. This will make more sense later as well. And of course, this story is going in super interesting places. And so over the next 5 episodes, we're going to have so much to talk about there. Yeah, this is going to be a really interesting show, and I look forward to talking about it more and watching more of it.
Can't wait for Henry Sest.
Yeah. Great. And we'll get more into the complexity of the romance stuff, the direction of the show, a lot more into the aesthetic stuff, both the visuals and the music of the show. We'll definitely talk more about that. We'll get deeper into the dynamics of the characters, and more characters are going to come, of course. There's all sorts of stuff to discuss as we get into the episodes that are still coming to us. Listeners, thanks for listening to our discussion, and we'd really like to see your thoughts on the show and what we had to say about it this week as well. So please comment away. We always love to see your thoughts too, so let us know what you think, and again, thank you very much for listening.